in very early March, I gave a short talk in the Houses of Parliament to a mixture, a voluntary group of peers and members of Parliament, where I was berating them for messing up the legislation on corporate governance. And I was quite brutal with them. And to my surprise, at the end of my little talk, I got a round of applause. I was not expecting that. And the surprise was that afterwards, people came up and said, do you know, we didn't know anything you were talking about. Not anything. But we have very firm opinions on what you were talking about, and we often express them in Parliament or in our constituencies. And so the issue became, after the session, how can we help people who often were not in Parliament at the time the legislation was passed, to help them to understand what the legislation is, and particularly how they can implement it. Because one of the big issues of the moment is increasingly a very good raft of laws, virtually none of which are properly implemented. And so the way I've suddenly started looking at corporate governance is not just about boards and directors, and it's not even about investors, and it's certainly not directly about regulators, but it's how we can bring those three people and the politicians together into a national or even an international system of learning how to develop effective corporate governance, excuse me, for not just our businesses, but also our state-owned enterprises and our not-for-profit enterprises. And that's, to my surprise and delight, within the last 3 months, has suddenly become very important to a lot of people. And my little book, Stop the Rot, wasn't selling very well. And suddenly, after the COVID lockdown, people are beginning to read it. I'm very pleased to say, because I think it actually addresses some of their fundamental issues. And as you saw from my CV, I spent about 30 years in and around China, I was there towards the end of the Cultural Revolution, and then from there on for about another 12 years, quite busily setting up business education in China. And there is an old Chinese curse, which is pretty well known around the world. And that is, may you live in interesting times. And unfortunately, now all of us are living in very interesting times. And that, in some ways, is terrific, because everybody is having to rethink, what on earth are we doing? So as soon as lockdown was declared in the UK, all my work stopped, because I had work in Malaysia, in Australia, New Zealand, in South Africa, in the Gulf, in the Caribbean, and a lot in the UK. And everything stopped because nobody could move. And that was before we began to learn how to use Zoom and Team and even Skype now, which is coming back with a vengeance. So I was stuck at home and thinking, now I've just had this effect in Parliament to with the consequence that they've asked me to write a short paper for their journal called Governance, which will come out next month. Where do I go from here? Well, it didn't take long to find out, because suddenly the phone started ringing like crazy. And it was clients, but it was also colleagues, and it was people I'd never heard of before, all of them saying, can you answer really two questions? One is, what does a company do now? And the second one is, what does a board do now? And those two really caused me to do a lot of thinking. And for a couple of weeks, I went into a bit of hibernation. And I wrote two very short papers, with each of those with the title that I've just given. And I set myself the impossible task of writing each in 2,000 words or less, which is really hard work. Much easier to write long papers than to write short papers, much easier. And at the end of it, I started testing it out by sending it to a few friends on the 5 continents and saying, look, here's a draft. What do you think? it just took off. I can't explain it easily, but it seemed to hit a raw nerve. And in the end, 50 people from different continents were corresponding with me, and it became a sort of samizdat version. So people were copying it and passing it on, and all sorts of things were happening. And I suddenly realized that maybe a lot more people don't know, rather like the politicians, a lot more people don't know about effective corporate governance than I ever realized. And that includes some of the directors, some of the investors, some of the regulators, and I know many of the politicians. So I suddenly started thinking, hey, hang on a second, let's have a look at these two questions. They need to go much deeper. Hopefully, tomorrow, the Royal Society of Arts in London will publish the combined paper, which is now called What Are Companies and Boards For Now, with a subtitle of Going Backwards to Go Forward Post-COVID. This fits a series of 7 what they call bridges into the future, which includes social activity, economic activity, a lot of health activity, etc., but now includes within it a bridge around governance. And as I say, God willing, tomorrow that will be published. They've had a few technical problems, but it should be online tomorrow from the Royal Society of Arts. And then there'll be some follow-through webinars and all the rest of it. And I've also been attacked quite strongly on the approach I've taken. In fact, one of my publishers attacked me very strongly a couple of weeks ago and said, I've just seen the drafts of those 2 papers you sent me. And I've just run them, I've trawled them through my word check machine, and there is absolutely nothing in there about Black Lives Matter, BAME, nothing about diversity, etc., etc. And I was a bit shocked when he said that. I thought he knew me better. And so I went back to him and said, look, no, that's true. Those words, apart from diversity, do not appear in the paper. However, what those words mean to me are symptoms of much deeper issues. And what my papers are about and what I'm looking at now are what are those deeper issues. And that's really where the notes I've sent you begin. So let me begin to run through a few of those deeper issues, because I think the pandemic has given us a wonderful chance to actually have a clean sheet of paper and say, if we are going to start again, what will we now write rather than everything that's come before? And I've got myself into a few bits of trouble, particularly in London, for advocating over the last year that we should actually drop all the corporate governance codes. We should actually have a clean sheet of paper, and we should go back and we should start again by looking at the role of the company and the role of the board and build any codes from there if we need any codes. So this has not made me very popular, except with a lot of company directors. But certainly in the official system, I was treated rather differently until 3 months ago, when suddenly the people who have been quite rude started saying, hey, there may be something in what you're saying. So what I pointed out to them, and here the rain is really lashing onto the roof at the moment, but I trust all is well. What I was saying to them was, why don't we go back to the year 1776, at which point they thought I was completely mad. But in that year, 3 publications came out, which I think actually shaped our present view of the business and the organizational world, and which I think will help us. If we look at the original questions they were trying to address, will help us with what we're trying to deal with now. And in that year, 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, or an investigation into the wealth of nations. And most people see that as the beginning of modern capitalism. And certainly Margaret Thatcher, for example, took it as absolute Bible except it proved that she hadn't actually read the book, because the book, over half of the book, is actually about moral sentiment. It's not about red in tooth and claw capitalism. It's actually about how do you generate wealth, and then how do you redistribute wealth. And remember that 20 years before, Adam Smith, who was the first ever professor of moral philosophy, had written a book called Moral Sentiment. And so he was pretty well up at it 20 years later. So that was one thing. So that was about the generation distribution of wealth. In the same year, 1776, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Swiss national, published, mainly in France, a book called The Social Contract. And that was about the relationship, the developing relationship between the individual and the state. And he particularly developed in that book the notion of rights and duties. And that issue of rights and duties, I think, is important and is reflected in some ways through the slightly misguided compliance codes I've seen in various countries, which tend to stress too much the duties of director and not enough on the rights of investors, the regulator of politicians, sorry, the duties of politicians, regulators, and underplay the rights of the board and the directors. So those two books, for me, were important. And then in 1776, some British rebels decided they were going to declare independence from Britain and publish the early part of their Declaration of Independence. And what intrigued me about that declaration is that it was trying to look at new ways of balancing power between the executive, the judiciary, and the, excuse me, I'm choking slightly here. Excuse me. The executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. Now, all of those three things, I think, that is the generation and redistribution of wealth, the generation and redistribution of what Jean-Jacques Rousseau was calling justice, so wealth justice, and then with the Declaration of Independence, wealth justice and power. These things, I think, are exactly where we might start if we were looking to redefine corporate governance, not necessarily at a national level, although that needs to be done, but particularly at the level of the many types of company we have. And I believe that companies are the social bond that holds our more advanced societies together. We come together as a group of individuals to get more than the output of each of those individuals for the common wealth, for the common good. And underpinning those notions of wealth, justice, and power are the values, the very human values of accountability, of probity or honest dealing, and of transparency, of being able to see what is actually happening. And Mr. Romano just now mentioned Wirecard, for example, and one of the great problems is that people are finding it really, really hard to see what on earth happened there, and why it was that the audits were not carried out in what would be considered a normal way. Now, behind that, I see a world, and I'm very fortunate to move between 5 continents frequently, where we have a seriously disillusioned public who don't trust our institutions and particularly our companies. We have increasingly discomforted stakeholders who are not at all sure that the way we have focused on shareholders rather than stakeholders is going to hold good for the future. We have very disconcerted politicians who do not know what levers now to pull. And we have very disconsolate directors saying, we seem to be being blamed for everything, but we're not really part of the system at the moment. We're seen as a cash cow, literally, and we sit out to the side. We're not part of a national or even regional debate about how wealth is generated and distributed. So these pictures are quite strong. And in my mind, one way of beginning to look at this is to say, look, for over 3,000 or over 3,500 years, we have used the term governance. So it comes from the ancient Greek, Kubernetes. And Kubernetes means two things. It has its parallel roots. It is a dilemma. It's two prongs of two horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, Kubernetes means the steersman of a ship, the person who gives direction to a ship. And that's quite a good metaphor. But Kubernetes also means, and it's moved all the way through to modern English, particularly in Silicon Valley and places like that now, Kubernetes also means cybernetics. That's where the word comes from. And so one of the things I think we now have to reframe is, how do we, as boards of directors, challenge with driving forward and cybernetics, keeping our systems under prudent control? How do we find the time and the skills to be able to do that? And it's a huge question. I have no simple answer to that, but it's what we're now faced with. And the pandemic, for all its awfulness, is actually giving us some space to think about that and to begin to look at how is it that we might move forward in that way. And it's international. I mean, I find it astonishing now that the work that's going on in, for example, the Arabian Gulf, the 6 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, with which I deal a lot, that is getting very, very interesting indeed. Because, for example, they're saying, well, up until now, we know we've got to move beyond energy in the next 50 years. That is official policy for the 6 countries. We've never really thought very much about how we do that. And we're now beginning to realize that virtually everything we're now talking to each other about is almost impossible, because the sorts of industries into which we might move with, it's still quite a lot of money that we have, our resources are quite high, would not be suitable for the quality of people we currently have in our country. It's just not on. And so I'm proud to be the first external examiner of the new program that the Gulf Cooperation Council have launched for the professionalization of directors. And I'll talk about that a little later on. But what they're saying is, look, we might talk about 50 years being beyond energy, but we've got to have a 10-year plan by which we professionalize not only our directors, but also our managers and our technical people. Because whatever new wealth generators we're going to have will need effective directors, effective managers, and effective techies. And if I'm going to be rude to some of the people listening in, but techies would include company secretaries, auditors, etc., that sort of thing. So that's a great interest to me, because it's not only that part of the world that's saying that. I find that message coming through all over the place, including now the UK. In fact, on Tuesday, in two days' time, I've been asked, much to my surprise, because I'm normally seen as an enemy, but I've been asked to be one of the opening speakers at the new Centre for Corporate Governance, which the Institute of Directors is opening in London. So that's going to be very interesting. I think a very sporting day when we talk through some of these issues. But if you think about looking at what we mean by wealth, what we mean by justice, what we mean by power, in many ways, a lot of countries sort of know what they've got to do, but it hasn't been explicit and it has not been brought together. And there certainly is no international simple statement on this, let alone a global statement. But there are three mega issues which we are, in a sense, the pandemic has brought into focus very clearly. One is, what do we do about the physical environment? And I think there is increasingly global, I won't say consensus, but the move towards a global understanding of what has to be done in different parts of the world. And that includes China, which is one of the major polluters. And I, if necessary, can talk a bit about that. But the other thing that's coming out now is, so not just the environment, but also how now do we begin to think about our communities and the distribution of wealth, the distribution of justice, and the distribution of power in those communities. And people are beginning to, and I immediately nod towards First Citizen and Linda's statement just now, that people are beginning to take some serious, not just rhetoric, but serious action in those areas. And I'll certainly come back to that. But behind that, there is a notion now that actually governance is going to be very important, much more than people say. It's very easy to use the word governance and not know what it means, really. But so I think what we're seeing, and it's now appearing in all sorts of ways, is this modern jargon ESG, environment, social, and governance, but environmental impact of our organizations, social impact of our organizations, and governance impact of our organizations. These are beginning to be focused. And we now see, if, for example, you look at the weekly, Financial Times now publishes an excellent weekly magazine called Moral Money. And Gillian Tett, the wonderful American editor of the FT, is now the editor as well of Moral Money. And if you look at what a lot of the investment funds are trying to do, they're trying to move in that direction, the ESG direction. In fact, lots of funds immediately put the ESG label on themselves. Now, you will know, as experienced folk, for the most part, that is a nonsense. You can easily label anything, but to actually make it work and deliver performance is another issue altogether. But it's coming. It's moving down the track, and we're moving away from what in America particularly was often called CRG, the compliance, regulatory governance type system, which was almost totally compliance related. And we're even moving away now from what used to be called CSR, the corporate social responsibility, because ESG seems to be transcend both of those two. And I'm just finding people are beginning to feel a lot more comfortable, at least at talking of those issues. The question is, how does one begin to move into any sort of action then? Well, in some ways, we're already doing it, because for at least 20 years, some companies have actually produced in their annual report what they call their triple bottom lines. And if you look at those who have done it very well, like the Danish company Novo Nordisk, and even some of the companies which nowadays are seen as the devil incarnate, like Shell, Shell, I praise them because for 20 years they have been publishing as part of their report detailed quantitative analysis of the triple bottom line, how they're doing financially, the impact they're having on the environment, and the impact they're having on their communities. And I'm not saying it's all perfect. It isn't by any stretch of the imagination. But at least they're doing it. They've done it. They've set up groups to monitor it. And I and others see other companies of various sizes, from very small to very large, beginning to move in this sort of direction. This is great news for auditors, because now we're looking more and more at having three types of auditor: the financial auditor, the environmental impact auditor, and the social impact auditor. And these are pretty Wild West type areas at the moment. So lots of people are muscling in on there, seeing quite big money to be made. But the actual metrics of those still have to be very carefully worked through. But they're happening. But they're definitely happening. Now, that then sets up some problems for boards. Because if that is the general direction in which we are moving, however messy, however erratic, what on earth do we do to allow our directors, our managers, our executives, our regulators, our legislators, and our investors to begin to go through some sort of reframing process? I won't call it re-education, but that's the implication really, but some sort of reframing process that allows people at board level to budget serious time and serious resource to actually face up to such a complicated future as a triple bottom line. And that is tricky. I say, I have no instant answers to that, although I'm working with people in various parts of the world on how we could begin to do it. Because if we're not careful, we will let our regulators pile more and more regulation on us in areas about which we know little, and frankly, I think quite a lot of the regulators don't know much more. For example, looking at diversity. For example, looking at the whole issue, which is easy to say, of culture. But if we're talking about diversity, are we just thinking along a compliance line? How many people of which sex do we have? How many people of which color do we have? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because that to me isn't diversity. That's just a compliance with a predetermined notion of what is politically right at the time. Not knocking any of those areas or issues, but saying that's possibly necessary, but it certainly isn't sufficient. Similarly, as we talk about culture, and I've talked a lot about culture, particularly recently in the UK, with politicians and regulators, and asked them to define culture. And I haven't had any explanation that I personally can understand. And so one of the possibilities that I put back to them is that maybe we need to build in some anthropologists to the work that boards are doing, so that they begin to understand the anthropological, rather rigorous approach to what a culture is and how it then can be developed. This doesn't always go down terribly well. They're normally a little more comfortable with the notion that maybe we should at least, at the very least, begin to understand human behavior. And I nod again to First Citizen in that direction, but especially to be the new field of behavioral economics, which is developing very rapidly, which I think for a board is an absolute godsend, because it begins to actually explain that you don't just have hard numbers, but you're searching also for ways of moving people, of nudging people in the jargon. And in doing that, you're beginning to think about what the meaning of our organization is for those who are working with it and for it and around it. So all these things are throwing up issues in very uncertain times. And what I see happening in various countries now is the beginning, and I commend you in what you're about to launch, is the beginning of saying, actually, being a director is very different from being a manager. Very different indeed. It requires, if you like, a helicopter view to rise above your professional disciplines, and often those disciplines are in accounting, audit, or legal, but not always. But you need the intellectual capacity, both individually and as a group, to rise above those disciplines, to begin to take a helicopter view of what is going on in these uncertain worlds, and then bring that into perspective by looking at that triple bottom line notion. Hence, again, I commend you for what you're doing, because in various countries now, people are looking at, around a boardroom table, how do we build levels of knowledge and how do we accredit those levels of knowledge? How do we build the necessary skills? And how do we therefore build the necessary attitudes that in the end lead through to the ethical basis of what we're doing? And I think if we begin to face those sort of problems, then we begin to face up to a lot of the issues that our disillusioned public around the world are asking of us. The question often from the disillusioned public that comes to me is not what is the board for, but shouldn't they be doing that already? The public has a great assumption that we know what we're doing. And some of us do, but unfortunately, sufficient of us don't, to allow some fairly large scandals to get out and about. So we do need to get a competence measures agreed at the levels of knowledge, attitudes, and skills. And that is possible to do. It's been done in other professions. That's where I'm saying at the moment, I think we should pay less attention to codes and more attention to building the basis of that. And in various countries, we have something to build on. If you look at a board in relation to the purpose of a company, particularly under common law, so that covers virtually all of the 54 Commonwealth countries, but including one of the largest in the world, India. And although they would never admit it publicly, but I know from my own personal experience, it covers to an extent China, which is using the common law of Hong Kong, despite all the current problems there, using that law to begin to build their corporate governance notions. And if you look at what the board is in relation to the purpose of a company, then we know from a number of legislatures that there are 6 simple elements there, binding every director to ensure the continuing long-term health of their company. And that alone, I think, is fundamental. And I would commend you to really begin to build from there. The notion of continuing long-term health of the company. And therefore, its purpose is to build into that wealth, justice, and excuse me, and power issue. To do this, they must be able to show that they have considered the following: the likely consequences of any decision taken by the board in the long term. So trying to force the thinking away from immediate consequences. But what are the long-term consequences of that? What are the interests of the business relationships with the employees? And again, First Citizen is interesting there. The need to foster the company's business relationships with suppliers, customers, and other stakeholders. So that notion there is, I think, very important. And the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment, which is interesting in its own right, because that immediately begins to put into context the triple bottom line notions. And then the desirability of the company maintaining a reputation for high standards of business conduct, so back to the ethical elements there, and the need to act fairly between members of the company. Now, what I've done there is pull together some quotes on the purpose of a board and the purpose of a company from various companies' acts or ordinances. But I mean, in truth, it's really based on section 172 of the 2006 UK's Companies Act. And what intrigues me in that is that that last sentence, the need to act fairly between members of the company, does not specifically mention shareholders. And that, I think, is very, I mean, it's implied, it's inferred, but shareholders are not, and that was something I started doing quite a lot of work on, because I was increasingly puzzled by a complete mess up in the common law back in the 1890s, when there was a special commission set up to try and resolve the issue of unlimited liability and what is called the controlling mind of the board. And they failed. So the one thing we know about a company at the moment in relation to shareholders is that nobody owns the company. Shareholders do not own the company. And yet much of the codes, financial as well as corporate governance, have either the explicit or the implicit assumption that they do. And that is fascinating. And that is something I'm taking up with the UK Parliament again this end. I may get nowhere, but I'm having a damn good go at raising this issue. And that's the point at which I got this little round of applause in Parliament immediately before the lockdown. So I think there are some of those folk who know that this has got to be resolved. Because if it's true, then we are beginning to see the end of the age of shareholder supremacy in our thinking about corporate governance. And if that's true, we're beginning to see the age of the CEO supremacy in our thinking about corporate governance. And so the responsibilities then come firmly back to the board to answer the director's dilemma. How do we drive ourselves forward? And yet, how do we keep ourselves under prudent control? And those I find very interesting. But then again, if I look at other legislations, the 7 duties of a director are now being, or beginning to be put together in other legislatures. They've been around for a long time, but most people haven't taken them very seriously. But I'm suggesting the 7 duties are the basis of building the professionalism of a director and a board. And those 7 duties are acting within their constitution. So that simply means understanding what's written in your memorandum and articles of association and not rushing off outside it. And then, back to reflect what I was saying in the previous section, promoting the success of their company, very important indeed, exercising independent judgment, and that is rarely, in truth, that is rarely done. It can be done, and good boards do it. But a lot of boards have people who sit on the board as a representative of investors or others, and don't realize that they should think independently and tend therefore to take instruction from third parties. And under common law, at least, that is clearly unlawful, and there are plenty of acts to show that. And then I think from the point of view of professionalization, a director needs to then exercise 3 things: reasonable care, skill, and diligence. So decisions and discussions and debates around a boardroom table need to be careful, skillful, and diligent. So sufficient time and effort is put in to really consider options during that decision-making process. And certainly now in the UK code, it actually says that if there is insufficient skill or experience around the boardroom table, then you are obliged to take professional advice outside the board, which is an interesting thought. And then the last 3 comes back to the probity issue. We must avoid conflicts of interest. We must not accept benefits from third parties, and we must declare interest in proposed transactions. And in some ways that sounds very easy, but in most countries I know, that's really difficult. And we're very open about the fact that the work we're doing in the 6 Gulf nations at the moment, those 3 are a nightmare, because most large businesses, some of them are global businesses, are mainly large family concerns, and trying to work out what's a conflict of interest, what are benefits from third parties, and what interest you declare in proposed transactions are really taking some time to begin to work through. And I think it's going to take us at least 5 years in legislative terms before we can actually begin to have any sort of clarity in that area. However, they are addressing these issues. It is an issue. If I'm being slightly flippant, but not very, 2 years ago in the Gulf, if I raised these issues, they said, no, we don't have to worry about it too much because it's unlikely that the third generation will take over most of the business because they're already too affluent to want to be directors. We most probably won't train any people up to be directors or managers. So what we'll do is we'll do an IPO, and then we'll buy in all the skills we need. What I've been doing in the last year is saying to them, one of the problems of doing an IPO is called due diligence. Which investors are going to buy into your company if the family mess is still there? And that's an unresolved issue at the moment, but people are now recognizing that it is an issue. So to achieve all that, we have to have regular and rigorous annual reviews of the boards and of the development of each individual director. And that's a step that people are now working towards. If we're going to satisfy a disgruntled public who will want some system by which they can have a lot more assurance that there will be more public oversight of the performance criteria for boards. So I think it's the job of the CCGI to begin to help move in these directions, whatever is relevant to your regional needs. I'm not saying there's one size fits all. But I know the countries that are trying to work in this direction are also willing to share their learning. So you are not on your own. So the people in the Gulf, I've actually cleared this talk with them and the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Board Development Institute there, Jane Vowles is saying, we're happy to share what we can. Folk in Australia, New Zealand, and certainly South Africa are all trying to move down these sort of tracks and are all saying we can help. None of us know exactly where we're going. None of us have the answer to this, but we're all willing to try and learn, and your certification program and theirs and others that are moving slowly but surely towards the Chartered Director Initiative will all be there. The Gulf has just had its first set of examinations, and I'll finish on this point. To my surprise and delight, 29 very senior and quite public directors put themselves forward to be examined in a very tough examination. And therefore they did quite a lot of training beforehand. It was 30 of them, 29 passed, and the one that didn't only just failed and is having a resit because it was on a very minor point. What's really thrilling to me is there are now 2 more cohorts behind them who want to be examined, who actually want to say, this is the sort of future we want to move towards. So I commend such an approach to you, and anything I can do to help what you're trying to do, you have my support. Thank you for listening.